Good afternoon again, my 2301 students. Now, this is going to be our last chapter for the semester, summer term. This is going to be a chapter on monetary policy. So we have talked about in the previous chapter about the concept of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, how shocks, real shocks and real aggregate demand shocks can move the economy to a recession, when you have shocks to demand and shocks to supply. Now, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about how the Federal Reserve can intervene in the economy using monetary policy to boost the economic growth, or they sometimes can use monetary policy to disinflate when the inflation is a problem. Like what the Fed is trying to do these days, they've been raising interest rates. They're trying to tamp down on inflation that has been building up in the US economy the past 2, 3, 4 years since COVID. So let me share my screen, then we'll talk about it. So here's our last chapter, chapter 35, monetary policy. So here's going to be the outline. Should be a fairly short chapter. We'll talk about monetary policy, the best case, where when you say the best case, that's a case when monetary policy is effective in achieving its intended goals. And then we'll talk about the negative real shock dilemma, right? Then when the Fed does too much, and of course, there's going to be some takeaway. So in this chapter, we turn to three key practical questions. When should the Federal Reserve try to influence aggregate demand? So our acronym for the Federal Reserve System, which is a U.S. central bank, is going to be the Fed. So the Fed always, because remember we talked about that in the previous chapter already, that aggregate demand is affected by spending growth, and spending growth is determined by money supply growth plus growth in the velocity of money, right? So that means when the Fed changes the growth rate of the money supply, aggregate demand is going to shift to the what? To the right or the left, depends on the direction of change. If they decrease the money supply growth, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. But if the Fed increases the supply of the growth rate of money supply, then the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. It depends on where the position of the economy is. If the goal of the Federal Reserve is to increase output to reduce the recession, get rid of recession, they are going to increase the money supply growth. But if the goal is to control inflation, to disinflate, they are going to reduce the money supply growth. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about when will the Fed be able to influence aggregate demand, and when will the Federal Reserve, when will the influence on aggregate demand result in higher GDP growth rates? So we're going to start with the best case, where it is clear what the Fed should do. We consider some reason why it is always clear which course of action is best for the Federal Reserve. We're going to consider why, in other cases, it's much harder for the Fed to respond effectively to different shocks to the macroeconomy. And we're going to learn that sometimes the Fed can contribute to a boom and subsequent bust. So we're going to examine the financial crisis that happened in 2007, because that crisis was really deep. It led to the Great American Recession of 2007, 2009. So let's start with a negative shock to aggregate demand, which John Maynard Keynes called animal spirit, emotions such as fear. So let's say the consumers start having fears on the economy. Maybe they think American families think that the economy is heading in the wrong direction. Maybe there's a fear that the recession might be coming, or maybe that they're going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their wealth on Wall Street because the stock market is crashing. Then they're going to cut spending. So if they cut spending, that's a negative shock to aggregate demand, because the AD curve is going to shift to the left. That's going to be the same thing with businesses. Businesses are going to feel the same thing too. Businesses can build confidence in the economy, depending on what they feel the direction of the economy is. If they feel the economy is headed to the wrong direction, maybe there's going to be low prospect for profitability. They cut spending. But if they know that the economy heads in the right direction, they're going to increase spending. So it just depends. So suppose the economy has been growing at 3% and the inflation rate is 7%. And let's say consumers become pessimistic. Pessimistic means you are less optimistic and borrowing and spending less. So that means that's a drop in consumer confidence. So banks lend less and entrepreneurs cut back on expansions and invest less. So this negative shock shifts the aggregate demand capital rate, and the growth rate of output is going to decline. Inflation is going to decline as well. So this is what's going to happen. So we begin always, our point of reference is going to be that we assume that before this shock happened, the economy was in stable long-run equilibrium. Long-run equilibrium occurs when all the three curves, remember in the previous chapter, intersect. When the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is that vertical line, and then the aggregate demand curve, the blue line, and the short-run aggregate supply curve, which slope upwards, they all intersect at one point. So the level of inflation is going to be 7%, and then the solo growth rate of 3%. And then all of a sudden, we're saying that the economy is hit by negative what? Shock to aggregate demand. Consumers stop spending money, businesses cut spending. So they can see that the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the what? To the left. A negative demand shock shifts the AD curve to the left. So the economy is going to be thrown away from its long-run stable macroeconomic equilibrium point to this short-run equilibrium, when the new aggregate demand curve, the red line, intersect the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, this intersection is no longer happening on the what? On the green line, on the long-run aggregate supply curve. It's actually happening to the left of the what? Of the long-run aggregate supply curve, meaning that GDP, the new equilibrium, short-run equilibrium is that inflation is going to fall, and then economic growth is going to slow down from 3% to -1%. So the economy might be in a recession. So now the Federal Reserve needs to act here, because the Fed always acts using monetary policy if the economy is in trouble like this, where the economy start to experience negative economic growth, inflation is falling here. So the best possible way is the Fed to try to shift this aggregate demand curve back using policy. And what the Fed is going to do, they may increase the growth rate of the money supply, because we have learned from the previous chapter that an increase in the money supply growth by the Fed or decrease in interest rates will show up aggregate demand once more. So aggregate demand curve will shift back to the right. So let's talk about the effectiveness of that policy. So the best case scenario is that eventually the economy will recover from the negative aggregate demand shock, fear recedes, and the economy returns to its steady state growth level. However, there is slow growth and increased unemployment, or even a recession in the meantime. So that calls for action sometimes from the Fed. So the Fed can combat this sluggish growth with monetary policy. The Fed can shift the aggregate demand curve back and to the right. The Fed can increase the rate of growth of money supply. That's what I talked about. Because right now, the reason why we're in a recessionary gap where the real GDP growth rate economy is slowing down is because aggregate demand curve has shifted to the left. The consumers are cutting back, investors are cutting back. That's the reason why we're in this recessionary gap in the first place. So because if that's a negative demand shock, we need to increase aggregate demand. And the Federal Reserve will do that by raising the money supply growth or lowering interest rate. So that's exactly what we're discussing here. You can reduce the interest rates and encourage more borrowing, or increasing the what? The rate of growth of money supply. When you increase the rate of growth of money supply as a Federal Reserve, that typically results into what? A reduction in interest rate. So that's exactly, this is the best case scenario, where, remember, the aggregate demand curve had shifted to the left. Remember? Yeah, we were here at this point. Now the Fed is going to shift that aggregate demand curve back by increasing the money supply to reverse the original impact of consumers cutting back on what? Spending, and businesses cutting back on spending. So when we shift the aggregate demand curve back, we go back to where the economy was before the what? Before the negative aggregate demand shock. So this is the best case scenario, that the Fed will restore the economy where it was before the shock, to its long-run stable macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay? So you can self-check your understanding here. Which monetary policy can the Fed use to increase aggregate demand? So we just talked about it. The Fed can increase the rate of growth of money supply. Okay, that's right. So A is a correct choice. Okay, so but monetary policy can be difficult because monetary policy is difficult because the Federal Reserve must operate in real time when much of the data about the state of the economy is unknown. and the Federal Reserve's control of money supply is incomplete and subject to uncertain lags. Let me talk about what these lags mean. So the key idea here is that when the economy is hit with a recession, okay, we know that the economy, if you're following like the classical theory that we talked about in the first place, classical theory that when you're in a recession, wages tend to fall in recession because of high unemployment. So remember that, so economy is organically recovering on its own, because as wages fall in a recession, the short-run aggregate supply curve would be shifting to the right to close the recessionary gap. So sometimes when the Fed start to intervene, that intervention may come late when the economy has almost self-recovered. And then when the Fed pumps in money, the economy can make matters worse, can cause more inflation. So that's, that's a case where the monetary policy can cause more problem than good. So I'll talk about that here. The case where the federal policy is just right. So remember, we start from point A. This is a point where the initial aggregate demand curve intersected the short-run supply curve and your long-run aggregate supply curve. This was where economy was stable. Then what we're saying is that suppose the economy falls in a recession, like the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, private sector investment decrease, and consumers are reducing spending. So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left from this dotted blue line to this solid red line. So the economy is going to be thrown away to point B, where I remember inflation falls from 7 to 6%, and real GDP growth is -1% from 3%, positive to negative. So the economy is slowing down and inflation is falling. Now, the Fed needs to, they need to act here because there's recession, there's high unemployment. So now, if the Fed acts too little, that means they just increase money supply growth a little, not enough. They are going to shift the demand curve to the right, but somewhat. So that demand curve is not going to shift all the way to where it was before the negative shock. So this is a case where, see, I drew this little arrow here, the shortest arrow here, saying that this is too little of a monetary policy intervention by the Fed. It's not enough to shift the aggregate demand curve back to where it was before the shock. So that's a case where the Fed is increasing the money supply growth just too little. That is not good enough to close that recessionary gap, to shift the aggregate demand curve back to point A. And then there's a case where the middle arrow, that's a case where monetary policy is just right. That's a case where the Fed has got it right. Because remember, we came from point A before the shock. We were at point A when the economy was stable. And then consumers and businesses cut spending. So the AD curve shifted to the left. So now if the Fed implements an appropriate or just enough policy that can help to take the economy back to where it was, that means the aggregate demand curve is going to shift from the solid red line back to the dotted blue. So we would restore full employment at point A. And then there are cases where the Fed may overstep, the Fed may overreact by overprinting money or over increasing this money supply growth and lowering interest rates. So you can see then the aggregate demand curve is going to increase too much. So it's going to overshoot the original long-run equilibrium. We're going to end up at point D. And that's a case where, the Fed may actually end up causing more inflation. So inflation is going to rise to like 9% because the Fed has overreacted to that to the aggregate demand shock. They over-increase money supply again. So there are three possible case scenarios there. Anytime the Fed may get it right, is it just right? Or the Fed may act too little. That's a case where the policy intervention by the Fed is not enough to move the economy back to its pre-shock period, like where, restoring full employment or, long-run equilibrium that we had before the shock. And then the case where the Fed is overreacting. There's too much intervention. Okay. So sometimes the Fed overstimulates the economy, increasing aggregate too much. That's a case I showed you already. Economies may get stuck between continuing a costly rate of inflation or reducing it at a risk of recession. So that's what we're talking about here. If the Fed oversteps and overreacts, we end up with another problem that we're going to end up at point D, where there's now inflation is rising. So the Fed can cause inflation that way if it overreacts. So many economists feel the Federal Reserve overstimulated the economy in the 1970s, which resulted in an inflation rate of about 13.5% in 1980. Okay. So by 1983, when Ronald Reagan was president, the federal chair, the Federal Reserve chair, the chair of the Federal Reserve at that time was called Paul Volcker, one of the most aggressive Federal Reserve chair who helped to disinflate, to help solve the U.S. inflationary problem, because inflation was getting out of hand in the late 70s and early 80s. So Paul Volcker was able to reduce inflation to 3%. What he did, he cut the money supply growth by almost 10%. So the consequence was that there was a very severe recession, because remember, when the Fed is cutting money supply growth, that means the Fed is raising interest rates. So while that policy can help to reduce inflation, it could bring another problem, because when the Fed is raising interest rates, that means businesses find it difficult to borrow money at high interest rates. So businesses may not invest that much in the economy, and that the risk is a recession. So while you have reduced inflation, there's another evil, that is what? High unemployment may creep up. So those are some of the trade-offs that the Fed, the trade-off that there are two macroeconomic evils that most policymakers hate, that we hate as policymakers and as economists. We hate inflation. Nobody likes inflation when prices are rising up on us and the cost of living is going up, like what has been happening in the global economy, not only the United States, And then we also hate high unemployment. The problem is when the Fed is trying to disinflate, to reduce inflation, that comes at a cost of what? Of high unemployment, sometimes. So the Fed needs to walk a very tightrope between balancing, when trying to, how much do you disinflate without risking to throw the economy in a recession. That happened in the 1970s and 80s. So the disinflation slowed inflation, but provided a foundation for 25. The good news is that disinflation was good for the long run outlook of the U.S. economy. It paved way for a long period of economic growth. So disinflation is a significant reduction in the rate of inflation. Deflation is a decrease in prices. That is a negative inflation rate. We know that. We talked about that even in the previous chapter. So a decrease in the rate of inflation is what we call disinflation. Okay. So it's big. So if a central bank wishes to undertake disinflation, if they try to reduce inflation, the policy must be credible. Okay, so let's talk about the credibility of policy. So if nominal wage growth is too high, workers will become expensive and employers may lay some workers off. That is a problem. Okay. The key to a less painful disinflation is to increase nominal wage flexibility. So workers will be prepared for slower wage growth and will quickly adjust to the inevitable. So we should not, we should find a way of convincing workers, that some slow wage growth might be good for them, as the Fed is trying to disinflate. So workers will be prepared for slower wage growth and will quickly adjust to the inevitable. So a credible disinflation therefore reduces the unemployment effects. Remember that. So if the policy of the Fed is trying to disinflate, to reduce inflation like they're doing these days, it has that policy, because we know it causes unemployment, it should be able to minimize some effects of what? Of unemployment on workers. So the credible monetary policy is when it is expected that a central bank will stick with its policy. If the market expects, let's say they see the Fed trying to raise interest rates to be able to reduce inflation, that policy is going to be credible if people if people expect the central bank to stick with that policy of increasing interest rates until when inflation is brought to a low level. But if the Fed keeps going back and forth, they raise interest rate here, then they give up, they start lowering interest rate when inflation is still high, then monetary policy becomes less credible. Okay. So the credibility of monetary policy is viewed in terms of the public's expectation of how the Fed is going to stick to a policy change. If the goal of the Fed is to disinflate through higher interest rates, if the market expect the Federal Reserve to stick to that policy, raising interest rate until when inflation is brought under control, then monetary policy becomes credible. But if the Fed raises interest rates here today, in that meeting today, then in the next meeting, they lower interest rate, then that policy might be less credible. Public may think the Fed is not very serious in trying to control inflation. So the fear and confidence are some of the most important shifters of aggregate demand. Remember that. One of the Federal Reserve's most powerful tools is its influence over expectations, namely its ability to boost market confidence. The Fed has that tool. When investors are uncertain, they often prefer to wait. This is compounded by what we call a bandwagon effect, as investors coordinate their action with others. So it can be very risky. So that means the Federal Reserve needs to be able to play with that people's expectations, the market expectation, because expectations can drive the economy to a hole. Tell you that. Okay. If people are expecting something bad to happen and that expectations keep building up, it's like more like a coordination effect. Eventually, the economy might actually fall. So market confidence, one of the Federal Reserve's most powerful tools, that is its influence over expectation, not its influence over the money supply, but over expectation. If the Fed can be able to influence people's expectation based on what it's doing on policy, then that is a good thing. Okay. For example, uncertain increase when we were hit by terrorist activities on 9/11, 2001, September 11, 2001. There was so much uncertainty. People didn't know what was coming next. Okay. So if enough people are taking the attacks as a signal to reduce investment, the bandwagon effect or uncertainty could have created a severe recession. But what the Fed did, the Fed increased lending to banks from $34 million to $45.5 billion on September 12th. So that helped to kind of reassure the market that the economy will not fall because people see the Fed acting, that you help to tame down expectations. So this helps stabilize expectation, reduce fear, and raise confidence in the market. But if the Fed had not acted to that degree, the public expectation of like fear would drive the US economy to a terrible recession. In fact, when 9/11 happened, the US economy experienced a recession, but it was a very mild recession, because the Federal Reserve was able to tame down people's expectation about what was going to come next. So let's talk about some monetary policy dilemma. The dilemma here is that a difficult case for monetary policy when the economy is hit by negative real shock, such as rapid oil price increase. So this is a terrible. So now I want to let you guys know that almost all post-World War II recessions in America have been caused by negative demand shocks. See what we talked about when aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. All recessions in America, most post-World War II recessions have been caused by what? A shift of the left of the aggregate demand curve. But a recession can also be caused by real shocks, when there are shocks to the supply side of the economy. Okay? When the shocks are coming from the supply side of the economy, that is a lot difficult to tame with policy, because you end up with that shock is going to bring two evils. Okay, prices are going to be rising, that is inflation, and then GDP is going to be falling. So you're going to have high unemployment. If the recession is caused by negative aggregate demand shock, where aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, the policymaker like the Federal Reserve or Congress, you only have one evil to worry about. And that evil is going to be what? High unemployment due to a recession. Because when the demand is shifting to the left, actually prices are falling. So inflation is not a problem. But as we're going to soon see, when the recession is caused by negative supply shock or real shock to the economy, like oil prices rising, that making the cost of production really high, or wars, civil wars, conflict, stuff like that we talked about in the past. or weather-related shocks. Those have the tendency of not only reducing growth rate, the economy slowing down, but also inflation will be rising at the same time. We call that stagflation. Stagflation is when the economy is slowing. So let me write this down here. I think the author of your textbook did not write it here. We talked about it here. Where are we in the slide? The difficult scenario here. So what I'm talking about here, so stagflation is when a recession and a recession means slowing economy. Economy is slowing down. That of course means what? That means high unemployment. When the economy slows down, when growth is slowing down, it means is when a recession, slowing economy, or higher employment and inflation are both happening at the same time. Are both happening at the same time. So this is primarily due to a negative real shock. A negative real shock. Okay. When I say negative real shock, that means coming from what? Supply shocks to the economy. And we already know what those real shocks are. We discussed them in the previous chapter, chapter 32. They're going to be shocks like wars that, destroy capital, destroy, labor. They're going to be technology shocks. Going to be things like, weather-related shocks, pandemic, those kind of stuff. So let's talk about how that looks like. So now, let's say this is your all long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. And then the economy experience a real shock. See, the real shock is going to shift the long run aggregate supply curve. And the economy is going to move from growing at 3%, solo growth, to negative 3%, because now this is going to be your new long run supply curve. So even though your aggregate demand curve might be passing through that point, and this is your short run aggregate supply curve, the economy is going to be what? There's going to be, the economy is going to experience inflation. Okay? Because remember, now you're moving from this point A to point B. So inflation is actually going from 2% to like 8%. But at the same time, remember, GDP is slowing down from 3% to negative 3%. So that is what we're calling a stagflation. Stagflation, when not only do you get a slowing economy, okay, economic growth is decreasing, but you also get rising prices, inflation. So you got two evils. You have inflation and high unemployment due to a recession, due to a slowing economy. Okay. Now, the Fed is going to be faced with a lot of dilemma here. What the question then is, what should the Fed do? You have higher inflation. And then you also have a recession, meaning high unemployment. So the Fed needs to pick a lesser of the two evils, because any policy that the Fed puts in place to disinflate, to reduce this inflation, is gonna even make the unemployment problem worse. It's gonna deepen the slump. Okay, so think about it. If the Fed wanted to decrease inflation, they have to slow down the growth rate of money supply. So remember now, this is your all demand curve. So when the Fed slows down the growth rate of money supply, decreases money supply and raises interest rate, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so that is going to intersect the aggregate supply curve, the short run at this point C. So while at least the Fed has tamed down inflation by 2 percentage points from 8 to 6%, see, economy is going to even slow further to 5%. You're going to deepen the recession. The recession gets even deeper. So this is what we call a policy dilemma. While you're able to at least tame down one economic evil, which is inflation, you are going to worsen the recessionary problem. You're going to deepen the slump. And again, when the Fed, what about if the Fed decided that they were going to, the main problem is to put Americans back to work? That means the Fed wants to shift the what? Shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Because you shift the aggregate demand to the right if you want to boost economic growth to reduce the recession. That means the Fed would be shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. See? Because remember, the economic growth, the long run had shifted up to here. So GDP growth had slowed from 3% to negative 3%. So now the Fed wants to reduce on this unemployment, on this recession by increasing the money supply. Increasing the money supply growth means the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. So see, so you end up at point C, where the new aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve is going to be meeting at point C. So at least you have helped to economy. The economy is no longer growing at negative 3%. At least now it's negative 1%. But the problem with while you're reducing the severity of the recession, you're causing more inflation. Because you're printing money, you're dumping money in the economy. You print more money, you cause a recession. So cause inflation. So you can see, so that's a policy dilemma of the Fed. So what have we learned here? If the recession is caused by a negative supply shock, a negative real shock, that results into a policy dilemma. Because not only will you have recession happening, which means high unemployment, you're also going to be having rising prices, inflation in the economy. So you have two big problems. You have inflation and high unemployment. Now the problem is you need to pick a less of the two evils, but if you're trying to reduce on unemployment, you end up even making the inflationary problem worse. If your goal is to tame down on prices, reduce inflation, you end up deepening the slump, making the recessionary problem even worse. Unemployment is even going to increase more. That's a policy dilemma of the Fed. So with a real shock, the central bank must choose between too low a rate of growth with a high rate of unemployment, too high a rate of inflation, those kind of stuff. So you're boxing. Okay. So a negative real shock poses difficulties for money. So this is basically testing your understanding. So a negative real shock, like shock to aggregate supply, poses difficulties for monetary policy because policymakers can reduce inflation or unemployment, but not both. So A is the correct choice. That's what we just talked about. So if you put in policy trying to disinflate to reduce inflation, you end up deepening the slump, making the recessionary problem even worse. That means high unemployment. If you try to reduce unemployment or reduce the recession, that means you're increasing the money supply growth. You're shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. That means you're making the inflationary problem even worse. Okay, so there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And so and that trade-off is what it was named after an economist called A.W. Phillips. It's called the Phillips curve. Some New Zealand economist is the one who first modeled this relationship. He found that there's a negative relationship between inflation and employment. So maybe your textbook doesn't whatever put that, but I can't kind of include that here so that you put this into context. So what we're saying is that the policy dilemma of the Fed is basically the trade-off that the Fed faces between inflation, fighting inflation. So if I put unemployment on this axis, and I put inflation on this axis, so there's a trade-off. This trade-off is what we call the Phillips curve, named after the New Zealand economist A.W. Phillips, who first came up with this theory, Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve basically shows a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. For example, if inflation is 10%. And then unemployment is 2%. When so that means at this point, inflation is a big problem. Anytime, so the Fed wants to, so let's say the Fed wants to reduce inflation to 3%. That is going to come at a cost of high unemployment. Unemployment may increase from 2 to like say 4%. So that's a trade-off. Because think about it, how does the Fed disinflate? We have discussed it over and over again. When you're disinflating, that means the Fed is raising interest rates. They're cutting the growth rate or reducing the growth rate of money supply. But when you raise interest rates, that means the cost of capital is going up. Businesses are going to find it hard to borrow money at high interest rates. And if they cannot borrow money for investment purposes, the economy is going to start slowing down. Then they're going to start laying off workers. That's the reason why unemployment is going to increase. Because the policy that the Fed is going to put to disinflate, to reduce inflation from 10 to 3%, comes with a cost of high unemployment. Okay. So in the late 1990s, the United States, so when the Fed does too much, the US economic growth was very strong and unemployment was low. The 2001 recession, which when we were hit by terrorist attack, did not last long. It was very mild recession, but unemployment continued to increase even after the recession had officially ended. 3 years later, after the recession ended, the unemployment rate remained near its recession high. Unemployment kept increasing until its peak with a 57.5% increase in June 2003 than it was in 2000 with a 4% unemployment rate. So the Fed started to push interest rate, federal funds rate, which is this short-term interest rate that the Fed controls when they're lowering. So they started to, from about 6.5% in 2000 to only 1% in 2004. So that's a very, the Fed was so aggressive. See, the Fed reduced interest rate from 6.5% to about 1%. Okay? Because they wanted, the idea was that this reduction in interest rate would bring inflation, as the unemployment fell because of that. But the Fed did a little bit too much. The consequence of that, what happened? When interest rates were reduced in the early 2000s, that brought another interesting problem. Because once interest rates were only up to around 1%, that means Americans started to go wild with borrowing. This is a low interest rate economy. That was the beginning of the housing crisis. Most Americans who could not even afford to buy houses because interest rates were very low, they were convinced that they could afford to buy a house. So most people bought expensive homes at low interest rate. Okay. And then in 2007, not surprising, because banks were also very reckless. Banks were giving mortgage loans to Americans who could not otherwise qualify for a mortgage. They were taking this risk. Okay, giving loaning money to Americans at very low interest rate. Not surprisingly, in 2006, 2007, those risky borrowers started to default on their mortgages. So foreclosures swept the country in 2007. See, and that led to the collapse of the economy, the financial system, because banks, once Americans start defaulting, that means banks lost on their balance sheet. All those loans had to be written off as bad loans. Okay, and then banks started to cut lending at that point in 2007. Then the economy went into a terrible recession. So that's another problem. If you lower interest rates so much as a Federal Reserve, you create an incentive for borrowers to start borrowing a lot of money, because they look at and low interest rate as a window for them to start buying homes. Mortgage rates are low, so everybody started to buy homes. So the low federal funds rate helped to make credit cheap throughout the economy. It encouraged people to take out more mortgages, beating up the price of homes. This fueled speculative bubble in the housing market. So the rates remained very low until mid-2005. In 2006, housing prices peaked. By 2007, they were in the free fall. The real estate crash. See, so that's the story of 2007. Okay, so this is a real house price index by Sheila. You can see the median price on whatever price index went up a lot. But then in 2006, home values had already peaked out. Then they start plummeting. Okay, so the housing market collapsed. So it is easy to say in retrospect that the Fed should have raised rates sooner or more quickly. There are several problems with this, though. Few people expected that a fall in housing prices would wreak as much havoc as it did. It's not always easy to identify when a bubble is present, when this unexpected increase in the price of homes were going on. And then monetary policy is a crude means of popping up a bubble because it affects the whole economy. When you lower interest rates so much, you can create that bubble. A bubble is basically an unrealistic expectations in the future value of an asset. So when interest rate, because the value of an asset, like the price of a home, is inversely related to interest rate. So when you lower interest rates, that means the prices of homes would be what? Would be rising. Okay, that's what it means. And if you continue lowering interest rate, the market is going to continue to expect that the home values are going to be what? Are always going to be rising. So it creates an incentive for them to even buy homes. A lot of Americans started to buy homes because they want to flip them for a profit, right? So you create this bubble. So the bubble is basically if everybody start to feel that this unrealistic expectation about the future rise in the price of a home, then the demand for housing keeps rising, and that keep driving up prices. But then it's going to reach a point where things are going to level out, where home values are not rising anymore, and they start falling. Once they start falling, that is an interesting dynamic for banks and for homeowners. So you may find somebody sign up for a $1 million mortgage, but the house price, the home value has fallen to only $600,000. So you owe more than the equity on the home. So, that is very interesting. That's exactly what happened in 2007. And the Fed was not regulating banks enough, and yet he had the power to do so. So there were a lot of things that went wrong in 2000. So here's some of your stuff. Which of the following strategies should the Fed have used to limit the recent housing bubble? Okay, the Fed should have maybe regulate maybe subprime mortgages. That was the cause of the problem, because there were banks that were giving out mortgages. Subprime basically meaning that you're giving subprime mortgages are mortgages that are given to Americans with very high interest rate, Americans with very high credit risk as subprime borrowers. If the banks were only lending money to responsible Americans with good credit ratings, like they're supposed to be doing, then you would be lending to those type of mortgages would be called what we call prime mortgages. Subprime means not to, you're lending money, giving mortgages to people who would otherwise not qualify for a home in a normal lending process. But that's what the banks did anyway. And the last thing I want to talk about here is what we call this a popular concept in monetary policy, or what we call rules versus discretion. So discretion, basically the idea that we should trust the Federal Reserve. The Fed should pursue policy, the way they see fit for the economy at any time. Like if the Fed feels like the economy is growing too slowly, they may make a judgment call to maybe decrease interest rate to start to stimulate economic growth. Or if they feel like this inflation might be something that might be creeping in, then they may want to put in policy to raise interest rates or try to disinflate. So that means that's discretion. You pursue policy according to the discretion of the central bank. But if you're implementing policy by rules basically means there are rules that are set for the central banker to follow. So they should never deviate from that rule. For example, the rule might be say that, we allow the money supply grow at 2-3% no matter what. So ideally, monetary policy adjusts for shocks to aggregate demand, but it's uncertain whether these adjustments are effective in reducing the volatility of output. So some economists believe the Federal Reserve should follow a consistent policy and not try to adjust to every aggregate demand shock. Because if they try to adjust to every aggregate demand shock, that's what I'm calling discretionary policy. oh, there's a problem, let's act. There's a problem, let's act. Because some economists believe that the Fed should follow a consistent policy, some rule-based policy. When so a typical monetary policy would set the target ranges for monetary aggregates like M1 and M2. So let the economy grow at a certain pace, you know what I mean? Or for the rate of inflation to, the inflation rate to grow at a certain level. A monetary rule works best only when monetary velocity does not change rapidly. When V is not changing that much, then it works well. But if M is constant and V falls, then either P must fall or Y output must fall, either way. Since prices are sticky in the short run always, the usual outcome is that both P and Y must fall, and a fall in Y means a recession. So other economists have suggested a nominal GDP rule, like keeping demand M times V, which is this component that determines what growth rate in spending, okay, to keeping it constant. Because if you keep it constant, then your nominal GDP is most likely going to be constant. So you end up stabilizing the economy. Okay. So here's what we are. Would a rule have been better? Because the Federal Reserve's policy is always through discretionary policy. So this is what happened during the 2007 crash. If the economy did not crash, we would be producing at full employment, this dotted line. But because we crashed, the actual output fell way below what our full potential was supposed to be. And this gap in output, this output gap, persisted for a long period of time. So some economists are arguing that if maybe the Federal Reserve had followed some rule-based monetary policy, maybe this gap would have been a lot closer, a little bit tighter, not wider like that. The economy, in other words, the recession would have been a lot milder. That is all about that chapter. Yeah, so I'm just gonna convert this again to to a permanent YouTube link, and I will share with you guys at Canvas. This is the end of the everything that we have for this class. It has been my pleasure to have you as my students. I'm gonna send you guys an email detailing what chapters you need to study for your final exam. And I'm gonna assign the last assignments, homework 7 is gonna be based on chapter 32, and quiz 7 is gonna be based on this last chapter. I'll try to make sure that I write as fewer questions as I can possibly, because I know towards the end, you must prepare for that final exam. Both of these 2 assignments are gonna be due on Thursday night. But your exam too, I'm gonna assign the exam on Thursday night, late in the evening. That exam is gonna be due until 5 p.m. on Friday. Thank you very much. Bye.